The biblical tale of Lucifer shows us that the most compelling villains are often born of tragedy rather than pure evil. In the book of Revelations, a great war erupts in heaven between Michael the archangel and the dragon, an ancient serpent known as Satan, who commands his own cohort of angels. Later passages, including Luke's Gospel, reveal that Jesus witnessed Satan fall like lightning from the sky. Aaron Burr's equally famous grandfather, Jonathan Edwards, had quite a bit to say on the subject. The Fire and Brimstone preacher notes that before his fall, Lucifer was the chief of all the angels, of the greatest natural capacity, strength, and wisdom, and highest in honor and dignity, the brightest of all those stars. He was the anointed cherub, an angel described in Ezekiel as residing on the holy mountain of God, walking amidst the stones of fire, whose wings were used to cover the throne of God, a throne which he eventually came to covet for himself. Historian Dustin Benge explains that Jonathan Edwards saw Lucifer's glory as immense, but always second to Christ. Lucifer was near the throne. Christ sat on it, exalted forever with God. Edwards then makes a stunning claim that all the brilliance summed up in Lucifer was only a type, a shadow of Christ. In his words, Lucifer, in having the excellency of all those glorious things that were about him, all summed up in him. He was a type of Christ, in whom all the glory and excellency of all elect creatures is more properly summed up as the head and fountain of all, as the brightness of all that reflects the light of the sun is summed up in the sun. The elevation of Christ was too much for God's right-hand angel. Lucifer reached for the crown, or should I say that he overreached, and for that he was cast down. Jonathan Edwards never lived to see his grandson's own fall from grace, but the parallels between Lucifer's rebellion and Aaron Burr's bid to steal the election of 1800 from Thomas Jefferson are striking. Of course, no one in that world, least of all George Washington, would have called themselves an angel. Yet Burr, driven partly by jealousy, reached far beyond his station. His hand was weaker than he thought. His punishment was exile into his own political hell, the vice presidency. You can even play Mad Libs with Edwards' language. Imagine it rewritten for Burr. Aaron Burr, being the leader of the Northern Democratic Republicans, one of the highest of the party, could not bear it, thought it below him and a great debasing of him. So he conceived rebellion against the President of the United States and drew away a vast company of the party with him. Jefferson, in his providence, was pleased thus to show the emptiness and vanity of Burr by allowing the head and crown of the whole nation to appear by his sudden fall from his glorious height into the lowest depths of hatefulness, deformity, and misery. In Lucifer's case, the fallen angel picked up that hateful, manifested crown to rule over hell. Aaron Burr would also pick up the scraps that he was left with, refashioning them as a new crown designed for a kingdom which he and his followers would carve out from the western United States and Mexico. From there, he dreamed of one day striking back at the nation that had cast him down. Burr might have avoided his fate as the fallen founder if he had looked to his grandfather's sermons. After all, Edwards warns that the devil's misery drives him to lash out blindly. Every strike only hastens judgment. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon America's fallen founder, Aaron Burr. Episode number 2, His Original Sin. None of this could have been foreseen in 1779, the year Aaron Burr ended his service to the Continental Army. The war would rage on until 1781. Burr, however, had already found recovery in the arms of his one true love, Theodosia. Their relationship began in scandal. She was married, to a British officer no less. Her husband, the lieutenant governor of Royal Georgia, served the crown faithfully, while Theodosia remained at their 98-acre estate in New Jersey. The Hermitage, as it was called, even served as a temporary headquarters for George Washington after the indecisive Battle of Monmouth. Historian Nancy Eisenberg notes the irony for us. Washington, the rebel commander, setting up camp on Loyalist property. Yet Theodosia was not unsympathetic to his cause. The rules of war at the time allowed for a kind of civility between elites that would vanish in later conflicts. Eisenberg reminds us that when General Charles Lee was captured by the British, he was treated as a gentleman, free to move about New York City despite his status as a prisoner of war. This was still a civil war, but not yet one of unrestrained brutality. A century later, Union General Ulysses S. Grant would order Philip Sheridan to follow the enemy to their death. In the Revolution, by contrast, a loyalist woman like Theodosia could host both sides, exchanging information with a dose of charm and a hint of subterfuge. Many men admired her. James Monroe even compared her to Penelope, the faithful wife of Odysseus. But it was Burr who captured her heart, impressing her by using his legal training to rescue her estate. Their bond was built on mutual admiration. Theodosia, 10 years older and already a mother of 5, offered maturity and wit. Burr, by now an avowed feminist who prized intelligent women, found in her a partner who matched his ideals. After her husband died of yellow fever in Jamaica, the two made their intentions clear. They would marry. But Burr wasn't ready to financially support a family. He had abandoned Princeton early to join the Revolution and quit the army a year before victory. Still recovering from war-induced neurosis, he followed in the footsteps of his surrogate father, earning a law degree in Albany. Within months of obtaining his license, he and Theodosia married. Soon after, their only child was born, a daughter Burr insisted bear her mother's name. But the joy didn't last. Theodosia, already showing signs of what was likely cancer, would not enjoy lasting health. Money was another burden. Burr never learned to live within his means. At the wedding itself, the couple had to share the date with his wife's younger sister, who had already paid for the priest and the catering. By all accounts, Aaron Burr was not only a good father to his daughter, but also an attentive husband and stepfather. To support his new family, he moved his law practice to New York City and invested in tutors for his stepsons, hoping to bring them into the profession one day. Theodosia's mother oversaw her daughter's education, but Burr took an active role as well. Together, the couple embraced an enlightened curriculum. They studied great women of history like Catherine the Great and read Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women. This was unusual for the time. Women's education was typically limited, designed to prepare them for domestic life while men were groomed for power. Historian Yuval Noah Harari in *Sapiens* explains that culture, not biology, is responsible for creating rules that limit women's capabilities. Montreal lawyer L.A. Hemmings pushes back, arguing that Harari underplays the role of male desire in sustaining patriarchy. She notes, "As a group, men are highly motivated by sex. A superficial peek at the billion-dollar pornography industry or a visit to a bar confirms this motivation. Historically, when a man married a woman, she became his property, with which he could do as he pleased. Women understood the deal. As non-persons under the law, they were incapable of owning property. Marriage was preferable, if not necessary, and in exchange for being housed and fed, regular sex was expected. Hemmings continues, comparing women's lack of choice under patriarchy to the struggles of marginalized groups under racism or caste hierarchies. In her view, the structure endured not because women were inferior, but because society gave them no real alternative. Burr rejected these assumptions. He gave his daughter an education that mirrored the rigor of his own at Princeton. By age 10, young Theodosia had mastered Latin and Greek, translated Horace, and studied Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Historian Nancy Eisenberg writes, "His ideal vision for Theodosia was that she could transcend the supposed defects of her sex. He knew and harbored no doubt that women could contribute to the growth of knowledge, to the spread of liberty, which was essential in a modern republic." This was Burr at his most idealistic and his most progressive. The Enlightenment encompassed a radical transformation of women's minds. His daughter's special calling was to prove that Wollstonecraft was right and that women were as capable as men of genius and reflection. But the key phrase in that sentence is "at his most progressive." As with so much in his life, Burr's ideals would tarnish. After his wife's death, he became notorious for his womanizing. His brilliant daughter, despite her promise, never fulfilled the lofty vision her parents had for her. She married for money to help resolve her father's endless financial troubles, only to be lost at sea soon after. That loss became legend. Some stories claim she was killed by pirates. Others that she was captured by a cannibalistic tribe in Texas. Pirates' deathbed confessions often mention a cultivated woman named Mrs. Theodosia Alston. One pirate, Benjamin Burdick, described her final moments, stating, "When her turn came to walk the fatal plank, she asked for a few moments. She retired to her berth and returned clad in pure white garments, a Bible in her hand. Calm and composed, she folded her hands and raised her eyes to heaven. She sank without a murmur or a sigh." Other tales, though, claim she escaped, hidden away in Virginia, buried beneath a grave marked only as "the stranger." The omission, some whispered, was the work of a husband too ashamed to reveal her true name after what her father had done to it. Before the Constitutional Convention reshaped the nation, real power rested with the states. In New York, 3 families dominated. The Clintons had power, the Livingstons had numbers, and the Schuylers had Hamilton. An uneasy alliance formed between the Livingstons and the Clintons, no relation to Bill and Hillary, bringing rising anti-federalists like Aaron Burr into the political spotlight. Burr was already a minor celebrity. His law practice thrived in New York City, where he was one of only 3 active attorneys after the British occupation. The war had left large swaths of the city in ruins, but New York rebounded quickly, doubling its population in just 2 years. The surge fueled a legal frenzy. Patriot newcomers targeted lingering loyalists, and lawsuits piled up. Alexander Hamilton, one of the other 2 lawyers in town, described it as a bountiful harvest of civil suits. At the center of these courtroom battles was the Trespass Act. This law allowed Patriot refugees to sue loyalists if their property had been damaged during the war. Hamilton took the loyalist side, representing wealthy clients eager to recover their seized estates. Burr, by contrast, defended the Patriots. To him, these cases weren't only about profit, They were a way to fund the repairs of a battered city and hold loyalists accountable for the chaos that they had helped to unleash. The two men had crossed paths before. Hamilton had applied to Princeton, Burr's alma mater, before settling at King's College. Both had served under prominent generals. Yet until now, they were little more than names to each other. Young men of promise on parallel tracks. It was in the courtrooms of New York that their personal war began, and it was a war destined to end not in arguments before a judge, but in gunfire on the dueling grounds of New Jersey. Rather than taking a principled stand, Aaron Burr took on every case he could, prosecuting as if he were running out of time. Some cases sought freedom for enslaved people. Others sought to restore enslaved people as property to their masters. Burr wasn't chasing ideals, he was chasing value. I often tell my students, look for work that leaves you feeling fulfilled. We spend an absurd portion of our lives at work, and the best you can hope for is to feel good about what you do. Not everyone has that luxury, though. Many have to take the job that simply pays the bills. Burr's own letters to Theodosia suggest that he found the law tedious, unworthy of his abilities. He wanted money, not meaning. To solve what he called the money conundrum, Burr dove headlong into speculative land grabs. Nearly every ambitious man of his generation dabbled in speculation. George Washington himself was among the nation's most aggressive. The game was simple. Buy huge tracts cheap. Wait for values to rise. Sell for profit. But the game was also dirty. Sellers lied about titles, about boundaries, even about whether they owned the land in the first place. More often than not, Burr was outfoxed. He borrowed heavily, lost repeatedly, and sank deeper into debt. In 1784, one of his old commanders put him on the ticket for the New York Assembly. Burr hadn't asked to serve. Unsurprisingly, his first term was a ghost performance. He introduced no bills, joined no debates, and skipped the first 3 weeks of session altogether. But after his re-election, something changed. Burr started showing up. He served on committees, revised state laws, and even shocked colleagues by proposing the immediate emancipation of New York slaves. On paper, the proposal fit Burr's Enlightenment ideals. In practice, it rang hollow. He himself owned 10 slaves. Someone truly committed to emancipation could have freed those men and women outright. Burr didn't. Pragmatism, utilitarian calculation won out. If emancipation happened for everyone, fine. He'd accept it as the cost of a level playing field. But he would not sacrifice his own advantage on the altar of moral principle. I understand that it's impossible to label any slaveholder as good. Yet by contemporary accounts, Burr was less brutal than most. He allowed his slaves some education, engaged them in conversation, and avoided regular corporal punishment. But that thin veneer of enlightenment never brought him to the right conclusion. His will confirmed it. He treated human beings as property to be passed on after his death. Here the contrast with Hamilton sharpens. Hamilton's abolitionist stance, however imperfect in practice, was real enough that it became central to his public persona. Burr, by comparison, hid behind pragmatism. One man thundered against slavery in principle, the other waited for the right time to act. That gap between idealism and opportunism was already widening into the personal and political gulf that would one day end in gunpowder and blood. Burr's dive into politics came too late for him to represent New York at the Constitutional Convention. The state had 3 delegates, Alexander Hamilton and 2 anti-federalists, Robert Yates, and John Lansing. The musical Hamilton portrays its namesake as a relentless force for expanding federal power. In reality, Hamilton was often absent, busy with legal work over the 4-month-long convention that replaced the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution. New York's real fireworks came from Yates and Lansing, related by marriage and philosophy. Both walked out, leaving their names off the final document, which only 39 of 70 delegates signed. They urged New York to reject it, a stance the state held until ratification became inevitable. Yates continued his attack through a series of letters under the pseudonym Brutus, railing against what he saw as a creeping dictatorship. Hamilton responded in kind, penning 51 of the 85 Federalist Papers with Madison and John Jay. Burr stayed silent, avoiding the public debate. In a private letter, he wrote, "After the adoption by 10 states, I think it became both politics and necessary that we should also adopt it. Practically, not principled, better to work within a flawed system than protest from outside." Over the course of the next 3 years, New York politics shifted dramatically, and Burr was at the center. With the Constitution adopted and Washington elected president, Hamilton's Schuyler faction sought to reclaim state control from Governor George Clinton, a radical anti-federalist. Hamilton, now serving as the nation's first Treasury Secretary, spearheaded Robert Yates' campaign. Burr, ideologically aligned with Yates, lent his support to the cause of a man who hoped to be America's Brutus. Clinton narrowly prevailed. Recognizing Burr's talent as securing votes for his opponent, the governor offered him the state's attorney general post, a low-paying but high-visibility position. In just 2 years at the job, Burr would argue a record-setting 158 cases before the newly formed Supreme Court. It was his effectiveness in this role which resulted in Clinton hatching the plot that would place Burr and Hamilton on a collision course, ensuring that only one of them would live to see their story told. At this time, senators were still chosen by state legislatures, a safeguard against what the founders feared: unchecked popular influence. The governor orchestrated a backroom deal, allowing Burr to squeak by with a 32-27 vote. The seat had been occupied by Philip Schuyler, Hamilton's father-in-law. Hamilton never forgave Burr. This promotion wasn't a reward, it was a message to the Schuyler faction. Burr was rising, and Hamilton would be watching every step. Eisenberg reveals that Burr was too independent to play by Hamilton's rules. He could never belong to a Hamiltonian network, and so Hamilton was bound to see him as a deterrent, a detractor, a potentially dangerous interloper. So in the spring of 1791, when Jefferson and Madison came by carriage to the heart of New York State, Hamilton took note. For the next 13 years, Burr would be the object of Hamilton's relentless political and personal attacks. If Hamilton's motive was not simply a matter of revenge, it might be more accurately called politics as usual. It was generally known by 1791 that Burr's star was on the rise, and Hamilton would be there every step along the way to nervously monitor its trajectory. Burr discovered his life's purpose in the Senate. Over 6 years, he served on more than 60 committees, primarily focused on land and military issues in the Western Territories. He carved out a niche as a moderate, despite identifying as a Democratic Republican, a party Jefferson formed to organize anti-federalists against Washington, Adams, and Hamilton. Burr flashed an independent streak, though, regularly voting on behalf of expanding the military, which directly conflicted with Jefferson's desire for small government. His attempt to stay above the fray backfired in 1792. Initially considered for governor of New York, Hamilton worked behind the scenes to persuade Chief Justice John Jay to run, ending Burr's hopes before they began. When claims of fraud arose, Burr and Rufus King, the state's Federalist senator, were called to settle the dispute. King ruled quickly in Jay's favor, but Burr remained unconvinced. He issued a 46-page report identifying legitimate irregularities, enough to swing the election to Clinton by just 108 votes. Eisenberg writes, his handling of the 1792 election controversy is a demonstration of Burr's politics. He adhered to Republican ideals, dispassionately sought out facts, and espoused a distinctive ideology. An ideology founded on the pursuit of justice and delivered with a candor that later detractors chose to overlook. These are hardly the actions of a man without principles, a man for or against nothing, as it suits his interest or ambition, as Hamilton would characterize Burr in a private letter. Burr returned to the Capitol in time to witness Washington's unanimous re-election. The hero of the Revolution remained untouchable, the vice president less so. The Democratic-Republicans' efforts set the stage for the next presidential election. Jefferson believed he could win, but the party fractured. Northerners, especially Federalists, were willing to accept Burr, but the Virginians running the show had other plans, backing New Yorker George Clinton, a candidate they thought easier to manage. Burr also became the target of a scathing letter-writing campaign from Hamilton. Eisenberg notes, over the years, Hamilton's personal attacks against Burr were consistent, and they all began with his three characterizations in the early 1790s: devoid of principles, privately reckless, yet personally powerful, willing to resort to any ploy if it would convince his reader. Hamilton justified his vilification of Burr by reinforcing it in the fall of 1792, claiming that he had a religious duty to oppose Burr's career. The attacks from both sides of the aisle sank Burr. Pennsylvania's electoral votes, pivotal in the election, mostly went to Jefferson, though 14 went to the sitting vice president, signaling both Burr's ambition and his limits. Life moved on. In 1793, Burr took a high-profile legal case representing New York's Maria Reynolds, a woman whose husband had used her affair to extort Hamilton. He lived on the same street as Washington, Jefferson, and congressional leader Pierre Butler, keeping a constant presence in the political orbit. In 1794, he introduced James Madison to his wife, Dolly Todd, cementing connections with the Virginian Brain Trust. That same year, Washington considered him for envoy to France, a cherished post as America's first ally was being swept up in its own revolution. But fate intervened. Theodosia passed away 1 month before Washington's appointment, ending 12 years of their devoted marriage. Burr later wrote that her death dealt me more pain than all sorrows combined. The loss would haunt him, shaping the ambitions and recklessness that followed. With James Monroe taking the position in France, Aaron Burr began a more active role within the Democratic Republicans, leading the charge against Jay's treaty. The Federalist-backed treaty, signed by Chief Justice John Jay, was an attempt to negotiate with Britain over seized American ships trading with France. It achieved only a lukewarm success. Britain agreed to limit seizures while the United States committed to paying pre-revolutionary debts. The treaty passed the Senate along party lines, creating the narrative of the Patriotic 10, Democratic Republicans who had bravely refused to sacrifice their country's commerce, rights, or honor. In truth, the treaty was deeply unpopular. John Jay was burned in effigy in Boston, and New Yorkers set copies ablaze in the streets, pelting Alexander Hamilton with stones when he tried to rally public support. Hamilton reportedly offered to duel one man and fight the rest one at a time. But despite the uproar, New York politics remained local. Jay won the governor's seat in absentia, never campaigning once. Burr, by contrast, broke tradition and campaigned actively, openly courting voters and hosting gatherings. Noah Webster described him as a certain little senator, running about the streets, whispering soft things in people's ears, and making large entertainments. Eisenberg notes, by campaigning openly, he exposed the hidden side of politics, revealing the mechanics of electioneering that most 18th century politicians concealed beneath the mask of virtuous disinterestedness. Despite losing, Burr spent months canvassing nationwide, tying Federalists to the unpopular treaty and spending time in Virginia and Philadelphia, the kingmakers of the era. When Washington stepped down after a second term, the nation faced its first contested presidential election. Each state selected electors, who had 2 votes for president. The design? Pick the 2 most qualified leaders, giving the winner the presidency and the runner-up a heartbeat away. But in the age of partisan politics, electors voted along party lines. The Democratic Republicans split regionally. Jefferson, reluctantly running, relied on Madison to rally support. But even Madison abandoned Philadelphia during the critical final months. Burr, meanwhile, campaigned tirelessly for both himself and the party, knocking on doors across Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Vermont. Yet he faced insurmountable obstacles. Northern Federalists considered him a viable vice presidential candidate for Adams, spooking Southern Republicans. Jefferson, determined to block Burr, orchestrated Southern electors to cast second votes strategically, ensuring Burr fell short. In the end, John Adams won the presidency with 71 votes, Jefferson followed with 68, and Burr came in fourth with 30, behind a South Carolina Federalist. Burr called the result the most humiliating moment of his life, declaring he would never trust the Virginians again. But even if every stray Republican vote had gone his way, he would still have fallen short. Northern New England offered him no support. Historian Stephen Kurtz observed, "No Republican of Madison's stature took over the direction of the campaign in the decisive last 3 months." Financial disaster compounded his political humiliation. Several land speculations collapsed, forcing him to mortgage his house and sell furniture to maintain appearances. Eisenberg writes, since 1793, he had occupied the Richmond Hill estate in what later became Greenwich Village, a sprawling 160-acre property, complete with English gardens, meadows stretching from the Hudson, and a man-made pond gracing the entrance. Burr had personally transformed the home into a political statement, reflecting his rise in New York and the young nation. The estate sold for $32,000 to a buyer who would later parcel it out, creating Greenwich Village and reaping millions. Around the same time, his daughter Theodosia married a South Carolinian she had never met, largely for financial security. Her husband was set to inherit 6,000 acres and 253 slaves. After the election, Burr returned to the New York State Assembly, laying low while Jefferson assumed the vice presidency. The Adams administration faced constant challenges. quasi-war with France, the Alien and Sedition Acts, and calls for Washington's return. Burr was named to a military committee alongside Hamilton. Though no war materialized, Hamilton briefly advocated for Burr as U.S. Quartermaster General. Eisenberg notes, Hamilton's ability to switch gears reconfirms a simple fact. His vicious criticism of Burr was motivated by simple politics. His fear of Burr as an opposition leader, not distaste for Burr's personal character. Still, Hamilton blocked Burr's advancement, planting doubts in Washington's mind, stating that, "By all that I have known and heard, Colonel Burr is a brave and able officer. But the question is, whether he has not equal talents at intrigue." The setback was minor. War with France never came, and Burr's ambition pointed him towards national prominence. The election of 1800 was upon us, providing us the setting for Burr's original sin and his subsequent fall from grace. Thomas Jefferson, the sitting vice president, challenged John Adams for the presidency. The thin-skinned Bostonian had primed the nation for change. Learning from the 1796 election, the Democratic Republicans were hyper-vigilant, vetting electors, candidates, and strategy. But they needed a Northern star, and Aaron Burr fit the bill, despite his prior vow never to trust Virginians again. While Jefferson's policies focused on farmers, Burr brought in Northern blue-collar support with his commercial agenda promoting internal improvements, lower taxes, and financial relief. Aaron Burr proved to be the right man for the job, as he had essentially assured Jefferson's ascendancy through careful maneuvering to capture the New York electors for the Democratic Republicans, a process which was widely described as a large-scale military engagement of forces led by Burr and Hamilton, the later of whom was regularly seen riding through the streets of New York atop his white steed, marshalling his canvassers to uncover every available vote. In the end, it was a rout, with 100% of the state's electors belonging to Burr. The landslide was a side effect of the intensely personal side of campaigning in 1800. Unlike modern elections, the battle was fought not statewide, but among a handful of key electors, whose support could make or break a candidate. Elections back then more closely resembled party primaries, rather than today's one-day winner-take-all affairs. Campaigns had to work state by state to win over the legislature to ensure a favorable slate of electors. Then, once the electors had been determined, each candidate had to wine and dine them to convince the voter to support their candidacy. As electors openly declared, the process was whittled down to a few key individuals. Thus, 1800 was fought amongst a handful of battleground individuals, rather than states. The importance of New York, the most likely northern state to flip to Jefferson, necessitated one of its own to join the Virginia ticket. It once again came down to Clinton and Burr, with the former bowing out due to age. Burr, on the other hand, agreed on one condition: that no one within the party would waver from supporting him in the name of politics. He insisted that his name must not be played the fool with. Historian David Stewart reveals that when the electors met in their respective states 7 months later, the Federalists observed perfect discipline. Adams tallied 65 votes, and his vice presidential running mate had 64. On the Republican side, however, there was a shocking bungle. The Republican electors slavishly respected Burr's demand that none should forsake him. 73 voted for Jefferson. 73 also voted for Burr. It would be a mistake to throw around the word unprecedented, as the Republic was so young that it was constantly being forced to confront something unknown. We proudly uphold that the election of 1800 was the first peaceful transition of power from one party to another. Lost in the myth-making was how close that transition came to plunging the new nation into rebellion. Jefferson and Burr had openly campaigned on the assumption that Jefferson, the sitting vice president, would be elected to the top office, with Burr coming along for the ride. The Federalists, however, had other ideas. Chief among the troublemakers was Alexander Hamilton, who had already attempted to interfere in the democratic process. After Burr had bested him in New York, Hamilton appealed to the Federalist governor, John Jay, with an outline of a brazen plan to subvert the will of the voters. He urged the governor to call a special session which would rewrite the rules for how electors are appointed, allowing them to propose their own alternative slate of pro-Federalists. In this instance of democratic malfeasance, John Jay's honor held up, nixing the subversion attempt with a wave of his hand. With John Adams running a distant third, it was foolhardy to believe that he had a chance. Instead of a come-from-behind victory, the Federalists dreamed of delaying the process to such a degree that the current president would remain in power until the deadlock was resolved or new elections were called. 8 of the Electoral College states were solidly in Jefferson's pocket. If the Federalists voted for Aaron Burr instead of Adams, they could swing 6 states to Aaron Burr. 2 others had tied electorates. If the Federalists could maintain the tie or shift them to Burr, then the Union would be drawn into a perpetual tie. Step 1 was to keep the election tied for as long as possible. Step 2 was to find a candidate who could win. Federalists, minus Hamilton, who continued to publicly question Burr's qualifications, launched a full-court press to flip him, hoping he might declare himself a Federalist in disguise. Such a plan could only occur in a world where Hamilton had spent decades defining Burr as a man without principle, driven solely by ambition and willing to betray anyone for personal gain. Most people still accept that portrayal, but Burr's actions during the campaign, his Senate record, and his conduct in this crisis suggest Hamilton's characterization was false, though, as we will see, it would later gain a disturbing resonance. Federalists tried to negotiate with Burr, hoping to preserve the central government. Voting began on February 11th, deadlocking through 19 ballots over 2 days. Jefferson was pressured to pledge support for the National Bank and other institutions. He refused, insisting he would not take office with his hands tied. The stakes escalated. Rumors swirled. Jefferson was accused of poisoning mankind by rejecting divine revelation. Historian Michael Belsills observes, rumors of assassination, arson, military preparations, revolution, and civil war swirled around the new capital. Most fearful were the Southern Republicans. They were certain the Federalists had secretly sent arms to Haiti's Toussaint Louverture for his slave rebellion, and were planning to do the same in D.C. Burr stayed away from Congress during the proceedings, inviting rumors that he was courting votes privately. Close supporters of Jefferson demanded that the New Yorker quit completely in order to break the deadlock, despite the fact that doing so would deny Burr the vice presidency, which he had worked so hard to obtain. While he wrote private letters reassuring Jefferson of his intentions, he remained silent in public, seemingly inviting rumors that he was entertaining the idea of seizing the top job for himself. Both sides mobilized militias. Massachusetts alone could field a force greater than 8 other states combined. Amid the chaos, Aaron Burr remained distant, watching silently. Jefferson wrote his daughter, "Hamilton is using his uttermost influence to procure my election rather than Colonel Burr's." Hamilton pressed Delaware elector James Bayard to switch, a single vote that could decide the presidency. Burr stayed publicly silent, privately reassuring Jefferson of his loyalty, maintaining plausible deniability while letting tension build as men like Hamilton worked behind the scenes. Finally, after 36 ballots, Bayard switched. Jefferson secured the presidency, becoming the only Republican elected, with Burr as vice president, a position he had worked tirelessly to obtain, though his near miss revealed the razor-thin line between triumph and disaster. As an explanation for why he went against the party that he led, Alexander Hamilton wrote that, "Mr. Jefferson, though too revolutionary in his notions, is yet a lover of liberty, and will be desirous of something like orderly government. Mr. Burr loves nothing but himself. No compact that he should make with any passion in his breast except ambition could be relied upon by himself. How then should we be able to rely upon any agreement with him? Mr. Jefferson, I suspect, will not dare much. Mr. Burr will." Stewart notes that, as angry as their political opponents were, many Republicans were even more unhappy with Burr, complaining that he had schemed to cheat Jefferson of victory. They believed Burr's public statements were carefully calibrated to maintain his Republican credentials while providing encouragement for Federalists to leapfrog into the presidency. In short, they thought he had played both ends against the middle. If that was his strategy, it had misfired completely. Burr had said just enough to encourage Federalists and anger Republicans, but he did not conclude the deals needed to secure the executive mansion. This aligns with Jefferson's thoughts on the proceedings. Burr became one of the least effective vice presidents in the nation's history, as the president kept him at arm's length, denied him patronage appointments, and strangled him politically. 3 years later, the nation ratified the 12th Amendment, permanently changing the way vice presidents are selected to prevent rivals from being forced to work together. Ironically, this was not needed under Federalist John Adams, who had worked hand in hand with the man he defeated just 4 years prior. Instead, the difficulties arose between two men of the same party, Burr and Jefferson. Rather than political purgatory, Jefferson and his allies condemned Aaron Burr to slave away in the Senate. There was no path back to the favor of the ruling elites. He had to make the best of the small fiefdom that remained. Like the biblical Lucifer, he continued to plot and steadily work to avoid his ultimate fate. That work began the day he was sworn into the nation's second highest office. Despite what everyone believed, Burr was convinced he could still recover everything. Desperate men do desperate things when hope is stripped away. For Aaron Burr, the nation's third vice president, that slim glimmer of hope would dim further when 2 states issued arrest orders for the murder of Alexander Hamilton at his hands. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.